Dom, of course, football editor at Reach PLC. You spent a lot of time covering Middlesbrough and, of course, over the years covering some of Middlesbrough's youth players as well. So just firstly, when reporting on youth players, do you find yourself, changing the way sometimes that you would write about them or certain turns of phrase that you might use when, perhaps if you're doing a match report?
Yeah, absolutely. It's, I think you've got to bear in mind that they're coming in with no experience whatsoever, so you wouldn't expect them to reach the same standard as what someone who played 100 or 200 games would. And secondly, you've got to bear in mind that these are 17, 18-year-old lads. They're not going to be as confident as others, and if you were to lay into them, even if they'd had a particularly poor display, kind of the damage that might do short term and long term. Obviously you've kind of got a job to do, and you would reference that they perhaps struggled, or perhaps with the way you'd word it, perhaps found the difference in level between under 23 football and senior football, but always try and kind of put a positive spin on it, how it's a great learning curve, they'll benefit from this experience down the line, because what's to gain from hammering a young lad on his debut? Every player's got to start somewhere, and every player's going to make mistakes and have difficult games and stages along the way.
Yeah, so along a similar line really, when doing obviously match reports, often you do match ratings sort of in the same way as maybe when you're actually writing, sort of in terms of using turns of phrase. Do you often find yourself sort of, when you go to rate a younger player or an academy graduate, perhaps being a little bit more generous on the ratings as again, as perhaps you might have been to a more senior player?
Yeah, again, you're very, very rare, unless a young player has come in and had an absolute shocker, and this has never happened. But if a young player comes in and gets sent off after 5 minutes, then that kind of dictates you can't give him a 6 or a 7 because he's lasted 5 minutes. But if they come in and play the full 90 minutes or play an hour or whatever, yeah, you kind of almost don't set them on the same bar as the others really. Now obviously you've still got to be, you can't, if they struggle, you can't give them an 8, for example. I guess you've got to be tactful with the way you report it. But as I said in the previous answer, it's kind of the wording of it, how it can be a learning curve, how they can benefit from the experience. And I think the other thing is you probably look for the positives more in their performance than you would others. You bear in mind who they're coming up against, what they might have done well, how they're linked up well with other players. Because what you've got to bear in mind is the very on this kind of stage for the first time, playing in front of 20,000, 30,000 people for the first time, coming up against players of a standard that they've probably never come up against before. There's all these external factors that you've got to bear in mind when you're kind of trying to come up with this number to rate their performance at the end of the first game or one of their early games.
In terms of more of a sit-down sense like we're doing now, if you ever have the opportunity to speak to a youngster, would your line of questioning ever change, in terms of, again, if you're interviewing a senior player, you might ask, more pressing questions and try and get, something out of them. Do you ever sort of feel yourself almost holding back a little bit because of the age and who it might be?
Yeah, I think, you certainly wouldn't put them under. But if you were interviewing a captain, it's the captain's job to kind of take responsibility to answer the difficult questions, to come out and face the press after a bad defeat or if things aren't going to plan. If you're interviewing a 17-year-old player or an 18-year-old player who's played 4 or 5 times, you don't want to put him in a position where he feels uncomfortable by asking questions that are not difficult, but that shouldn't be put to a 17-year-old in that position. And also, you don't want to ask him questions that ultimately he can't answer. I think they're bound to be nervous. It's going to be new to them, kind of sitting down and speaking to the press. So your primary concern is kind of making them feel comfortable, really. And I think the other thing is, if you're sitting down with a player in that environment, they've come in and they've just made the debut or they've played a few times. Really, the angle you want to know is how did it get to this point? You know, talk me through your football journey from starting at 7 or 8 or whatever to this stage. Kind of, you know, what are your loved ones and nearest and dearest make of it? Were you a season ticket holder in the stands watching this game or that game? You're coming at it more from a personal point of view. And again, what you don't want to do is kind of hammer them so they leave the interview kind of quaking and not wanting another experience like that.
Often there's a lot of academy players that come through and get to a certain age and then perhaps move on or don't quite make it at Middlesbrough, for example. Why do you think there's such a sort of clamour from fans? You know, often you see Gazette articles about, you know, we've just been speaking about Jonathan Franks there, about potentially players that have gone away and had a career. Why do you think fans sort of love that content so much?
I think first things first, we've all been those players. You know, we've all, or the vast majority of us, have kind of grown up playing football, wanting to play for Borough, and then, you know, at one stage or another we realise that that's not going to happen. So when you have players who've kind of come through that journey and been successful, you tap into them, their story more. You want them to succeed more. You know, if you get a 17-year-old lad who's grew up in Park End and is making it into the first team, and has been a Borough fan all his life, his parents are Borough fans, it goes without saying that you want them to succeed. Probably over someone who you've paid $3 million for, who has no kind of emotional connection with Borough. I think it's that emotional connection that ties us in. And then secondly, you know, even if they're going to go elsewhere and not play at Borough, it's still a kind of Teesside of done good, isn't it? You know, when you look down the Championship, League One and League Two, there are Borough Academy graduates dotted around everywhere, and that's still a success for the academy to have these players playing professional football elsewhere. That's still, you know, the academy staff having done their job.
Yeah, in terms of, you know, players that have come through and made an immediate impact, you know, today we're seeing reports of Jed Spence being linked with multi-million-pound moves here, there and everywhere almost, but can you remember, whilst covering Borough, one particular performance from a youngster where they've come in and, you know, there may have been talk about them beforehand, or it may have been, you know, not really much has been said, and it sort of took you back on how much they settled in and how well they played on their debut?
Spence is the obvious one. When he broke through into the team, he'd been talked about for a little while, but certainly not to the extent that he was going to burst onto the scene like he did in the December of Jonathan Woodgate's time in charge. He came in, got man of the match, won Young Player of the Month for that December, I think it was. And you know, you're watching him thinking, why hasn't he been in the team for the last 3 or 4 months? And it generates such excitement, doesn't it, when a young player comes in and does that. So Spence is undoubtedly one. I think Isaiah Jones this year is another one where he was known about because we'd seen glimpses of him last year and we knew he'd impressed at Queen of the South last year. But I don't think anyone expected him to burst on the scene like he has done. I remember speaking to Neil Warnock after one friendly game, it might have been at Rotherham or York in the summer, and he was saying how there's been League Two clubs interested in a loan move, but he doesn't want to sanction a loan yet because he wants to see who he can bring in first. So again, that's no criticism of Warnock, but he clearly didn't expect Jones at that stage to make the step he has. Other players, you know, going back long before my time of covering Borough, Stewie Downing was talked about for years and years coming through, and there was a real buzz and excitement about him. And I remember the excitement around the town when he burst into the team. You know, he had to bide his time on the bench and serve his time, and there was a clamour for him to get in the team. Then there was an injury, Zenda moved inside, and the rest is history, really. And then most recently, Josh Coburn, kind of from one extreme to the other, whereas Downing had been talked about for years. Coburn came under the radar, really, and was an unknown name and an unknown quantity when he appeared in and around the squad, but you know, has taken every opportunity he's got so far and looks a real promise for the future and for now.
Yeah, and just finally, in terms of, you know, with the obvious factor of social media now, and you know, it's not just traditional media anymore where you would only potentially hear from a player if it was a sort of newspaper face-to-face interview. Do you know if there's any protocols in place or training currently at the club as to how, you know, they are trained on how to deal with social media, but also, you know, speaking to more traditional media?
I don't know if there's formal training as such, as in like a course that they go on, but right from Dave Parnaby's time at the club, the focus is on kind of producing good people as well as good players. There's so much more to it than going out and training for 3 hours a day. You know, they're producing players, they're producing good people, good players, and people who, if for whatever reason they aren't successful at Borough, they can go on and be successful in other walks of life. And in terms of preparing for the media these days and the whole media landscape and the constant glare that's on them, it's a must for young players coming through, because you can't escape it, can you? I think I feel sorry for them somewhat in that it's a good thing and it's to be applauded that they have social media, and I see when players engage with fans and it's to be applauded, but then equally I see some of the mentions and messages players get immediately after a bad performance, and you think, well, that can't be good for anyone's mental health. So for a young player coming through to read that, you know, we can all work on trying to be thick-skinned, but everyone's got a line. And if you get so much criticism, it's bound to have an impact. And I think the other thing is, you know, you can't go anywhere these days without being a camera phone away from being spotted doing this or that. And, you know, we've got to remember that players are just people, and ultimately, as much as a lot of us don't want to admit it, it's a job for them being a footballer. Everyone needs an off switch, and they need some time for themselves, and footballers, especially at the highest level, don't really get that. So they absolutely need to be equipped for what comes with life as a footballer off the pitch.